I am recording the audio with my phone again. Hopefully I'll move it around less than I did in the last recording and it won't sound so terrible. Please try to ignore the sound of the neighbor's water heater and the neighbor's kids and the wind. It's not ideal conditions for recording today, but it's what I've got to work with, and I've only got half an hour until I've got to go. The topic for today's class is weird realizations of the English R sound. Now, already, R is a really weird sound. In most languages, you will find a sort of rhotic, whatever that means. No one knows what that means. But it'll usually be something like R, or at least R, like a tap. For English to have a R sound is already weird in and of itself. But when you look into the different regional pronunciations of R and the different sort of phonetic realizations that it can have, it becomes even weirder because there's a lot of variety in a sound that seems fairly regular across the language. So the first one that's most common and that most people will be familiar with is that in the south of England it takes on a sort of labiodental sound, the sort of R kind of approximant. And this has been around since I think the 1800s, or maybe the 1700s, but I'm fairly certain it's the 1800s. I've talked about this in my previous video as also a feature of Jafton English, of where I come from in the middle of nowhere, and it's weird that they would happen there as well as in London, because those are very disparate places. But I think the reason it happened in Jafton too was because a lot of the people in Jafton who weren't indigenous were immigrants, second generation immigrants from Ireland and South Africa and places like that. The only thing that I'm pretty sure of is that it was an imported feature rather than having evolved there organically. In America, there are two different types of R. There's the alveolar one. Well, there's three, really. There's the alveolar one, and then there's the retroflex one. So there's car and car, and that was terribly executed on my part. It's easiest to hear the difference in R-colored vowels like nurse and letter.
Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford.
And its adherents refer to it as the absurd.
There's also a third sound that's neither of these, even though it sounds more similar to the rhotic one, and that is the molar rhotic, which is a R. The molar R is done by sort of bunching up the tongue in the back of your mouth, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference between a retroflex and a molar R in practice because they're both articulated at the same place. And that sounds confusing because one's done with the body of the tongue and one's done with the tip of the tongue, but the way that it works is that the tip of the tongue for the retroflex one curls back sort of behind the alveolar ridge and sends the air over the tip of the tongue that way, whereas the molar one bunches up and sends the air over the tongue, but it does so in a way that it goes over pretty much the exact same spot just behind the gum ridge. And so for both of those R's, even though the body of the tongue moves in totally different ways to produce either one of them, they're still basically indistinguishable in practical speech, purely because the air goes through the exact same spot each time. The most interesting articulation of R that I've ever heard in English is the Northumbrian burr, and this is pretty much exclusive to Northumbria in England, sort of like the north in one of the corners, I think the northwest corner, but it might be northeast, something like that. It's in the north of England, and it's very regionally, oh my god, they're so loud. It's very regionally isolated and distinct. The first recorded description of it that is definitely for certain that's it is in 1724 by clergyman and language nerd Hugh Jones, which is just such a generic name. And he says, the natives of Northumberland are distinguished by a shibboleth upon their tongues in pronouncing the letter R, which they cannot utter without a hollow jarring in the throat. And that sounds pretty definitively. Not only is it distinctive to Northumberland, but it's sort of in articulation as well how he's describing it. It's basically, that's gotta be the Northumbrian burr. And what the Northumbrian burr is a uvular sound. So instead of saying R, you say something like R. It's labialized in some speakers and not labialized in others.
Oh, it's an effort of making real sound. An iron plate on the backside and an iron plate on the front. About 3/4 of an inch. It takes a good strong fella to drive them right up,
And the ran the fox straight to the same hole. No, I just had a rifle. A rifle, I just went forward to his ribs and I never expected I was going to lose. I just kept three, never think they'll get out the breed. You couldn't get the same breed again.
One interesting effect that the Northumbrian bird did have was on the surrounding vowels, and in pretty much every dialect of English, if a rhotic follows a vowel, then the vowel gets changed because of it. The easiest place to see this is R colouring in America. Instead of people saying nurse, they'll say nurse, where the sort of sound is held throughout the entire duration of the vowel. But an interesting thing happened in Northumberland because of this burring at the uvular place of articulation. A thing that happens commonly with uvular consonants is that they lower vowels around them. And you can hear this in... My favourite example is with click consonants, like in... there's this one also wedding song that everyone knows is the click song, and it starts with... But you can hear in the first word... It's not with the E sort of staying level, it's where it sort of E rises up from a central position into an E. And that's just sort of because of the way that the tongue bends to make a uvular sound. For the sound, it involves the tongue going up to the back of the uvula and sort of closing off at the uvula, and then the front going up to the alveolar ridge, and that creates a vacuum, and then the front of the tongue comes down from the gum ridge and makes the like popping sound. And so since it involves a uvular closure at the back, even though you can't really hear a uvular sound, the uvular place of articulation still affects the vowel. And so since the tongue is all bunched up at the back of the mouth to make this it's so cold out here. Since the tongue is all bunched up at the back of the mouth to create this uvular closure, it has to move forward to create the high front vowel E. And so you get a sort of diphthong that's E. Instead of a flat E, it's a E. This sort of theme of uvular consonants making high vowels go low is common in pretty much any language that has uvular consonants. It's sort of a linguistic universal, if those exist. And one way that this affected Northumbrian English is the North-Nurse merger, which when I read that, I was like, what are they even talking about? How could those words merge? And it's saying that the vowel in first and nurse and something went from like then to like at the back of the throat, and then the sort of backed with this uvular rhotic, and it became something like or. And that they make it clear, like in transcriptions of it, that it's not or with a rhotic at the end. The entire vowel is sort of roticized in a weird uvular way.
The nath, that's the centre. You tone that first. You tone it on an eighth,
And she went in after her. Never saw her no more. I lost her. And I've had dozens since, and not worth tuppence.
I just want to finish off with a sort of speculative thing that I've seen. I've been researching the history of American phonology recently, and I came across a thing by Charles Hall Grandgent, I think is his name, or Grandgent, or something like that, from 1893, and he describes the three different kinds of R that you hear in American English at that time. There's the R that comes with R colouring, which he describes as its own sort of sound, and then he describes two separate sounds. And he says these are universal for rhotic speakers in America at the time. He describes two separate sounds for when R comes before a vowel and when R doesn't come before a vowel. He describes the one that isn't before a vowel, that's before consonants or at the end of words, as a retracted R made by, he says, turning the point of the tongue up towards the root of the mouth, or the roof of the mouth. And this sounds pretty much just like the retroflex R that I've been talking about, and that's pretty prevalent in American English. But he describes an additional one, and this is the normal R. And this one is pronounced under all circumstances by most rhotic speakers in America at the time before a vowel. And he says it's done by bringing the tip of the tongue near the roots of the teeth, leaving a small triangular hole through which the voiced breath issues with a slight buzz. And that sounds pretty much just like a normal alveolar rhotic, like a R, but he doesn't specify the buzzing when he describes the retroflex one. And the buzzing kind of stands out to me because when I pronounce an alveolar R, like a R, I don't really hear a buzz of any kind. And so this leads me to think that somehow in the late 19th century, at least in America, the rhotic was kind of fricated. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I've never seen it. I've never heard it said. but it's kind of like it has a slight fricative quality to it, I'm thinking. Sort of like a r instead of just a r, like a plain r. To me, it kind of stands out with that sort of description of a buzz. And also, he specifies that it's a small triangular hole, which is like, when I pronounce an alveolar r, I don't have a hole or anything. The tongue doesn't make enough contact with the gum ridge to make a hole of any kind. There's just no contact in the first place. And so it really stands out to me that there's this sort of fricative R sort of pronunciation by Americans in the late 19th century. And that I've never seen that backed up anywhere else. I've never seen anyone else mention that. And so it's very confusing, and that leads me to believe that I could just be like misinterpreting something that is worded a bit strangely. So yeah, that is my that is a few things that I find interesting about the rhotic sound in English. And it just like it's just an interesting topic to me, purely because there's lots of variation in it, but at the same time it's a very familiar sound for us English speakers. And for like people who study English, variation in the letter R is a very universal thing in that it's not universal. Like, it's common across dialects of English to see R pronounced in a weird way or to influence vowels in a weird way. And so those are just some renditions of R by English dialects that I thought you might find interesting. I still don't have an outro. Have a nice day.